Every war on this list started with something small. A missing tribute, a handshake that was never returned, a man who forgot his place, or a man who refused to accept his. And every war on this list ended the same way. Bodies, in streets, in restaurants, in cars, in churches, in front of wives, in front of children, in front of God. These are not wars from movies. These are not Marlon Brando and Al Pacino. These are real men with real families who died real deaths on real streets. In Sicily, in Palermo, in Naples, in New York, in Chicago. This is the top 10 deadliest mob wars in Italian crime history. And by the time we reach number 1, you will understand why an entire society learned to look the other way. Number 10. The Greco-Chiaculi Massacre and the First Mafia War, Sicily, 1962 to 1963. Over 70 dead. In the early 1960s, heroin changed everything. Before the post-war drug trade, the Sicilian mafia, the Cosa Nostra, had managed its internal conflicts through a body called the Commissione, a governing council that was supposed to prevent exactly what was about to happen. It failed. The Greco family of Chiaculi controlled one of the most powerful clans on the island. When a dispute over heroin trafficking profits fractured the Commissione, the Grecos and their allies went to war against rival families in Palermo. Bosses were killed at dinner tables. Men disappeared from their own neighborhoods. The body count climbed past 70 in under 2 years. The war ended not because of a truce, but because of a car bomb. On June 30th, 1963, in the Chiaculi district of Palermo, a Giulietta automobile was left on a roadside. Police and military officers were called to investigate a suspicious vehicle. 7 of them were killed when the bomb exploded. The Italian state could no longer ignore what was happening. Mass arrests followed. Hundreds of mafia members were detained. The Commissione was effectively dissolved. But the Cosa Nostra did not die. It went underground, and it came back stronger. Number 9. The Gallo-Profaci War, Brooklyn, New York, 1961 to 1963. Over 15 dead. Joe Profaci ran the smallest of New York's 5 families, but he ran it like a feudal lord. He taxed his own men, not just a percentage of earnings. He charged them tribute for the right to exist inside his organization. A fee to be a member. A fee to make money. A fee to breathe. 3 brothers, Larry, Albert, and Joe Gallo, decided they had paid enough. In 1961, the Gallos kidnapped 4 of Profaci's top men, including his underboss, and held them hostage to force a renegotiation. It was audacious. It was nearly suicidal. Profaci agreed to their demands, released their associates, and then immediately broke every promise he made. The war that followed was asymmetric and brutal. The Gallos were outnumbered. Their President Street crew, in Red Hook, Brooklyn, turned their social club into a fortified compound. They kept a lion in the basement as a warning to anyone who came too close. Profaci died of cancer in 1962 before the war concluded. His successor, Joe Magliocco, continued it. By the time a Commissione brokered peace arrived in 1963, more than 15 men were dead, and the Gallo faction had proven something dangerous: that a small, disciplined crew could survive a war against a much larger family if they were willing to be relentless. Joe Gallo took that lesson seriously. It would get him killed a decade later. Number 8. The Banana War, New York, 1966 to 1969. Over 20 dead. Joe Bonanno was the boss of one of the five families and one of the founding members of the American Cosa Nostra. He was also, by the mid-1960s, the most dangerous man in New York, not because he was the most violent, but because he was the most ambitious. Bonanno allegedly plotted to assassinate three other New York bosses simultaneously: Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, and Stefano Magaddino. He called it the banana split. The other families called it treason. When the plot was discovered, Bonanno was summoned before the Commissione and refused to appear. He was abducted off a Park Avenue sidewalk in October 1964 and held for 19 days. The abduction was never officially explained. Bonanno later claimed he was held by his own cousin. When he resurfaced, the war began. His loyalists versus the Commissione-backed faction within his own family. His own son, Salvatore Bonanno, fought alongside him. His own men were killed in front of him. The FBI called it the Banana War. It lasted 3 years and left over 20 dead. Joe Bonanno eventually retired to Arizona under Commissione pressure. He wrote a memoir. He died at 97 years old in 2002, in bed, which, in his world, was an extraordinary achievement. Number 7. The Colombo War, Brooklyn, New York, 1971 to 1975. Over 20 dead. Joe Gallo came home from prison in 1971, a changed man. He had spent time in the Attica and Auburn state prisons, read extensively, befriended black Muslim inmates, and decided that the Colombo family, the successor to Profaci's organization, still owed him a debt. He began recruiting black and Puerto Rican members into his crew, a radical departure from Cosa Nostra tradition. He built relationships in Greenwich Village with writers and actors. He ate at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. He became, briefly, a celebrity. On April 7, 1972, Joe Gallo was shot at Umberto's Clam House just after midnight, while celebrating his 43rd birthday. He was hit multiple times. He staggered outside, crossed Hester Street, and died on the curb. His sister and daughter were at the table when it happened. The war his death deepened had already claimed the boss himself. Joseph Colombo had been shot in the head at his own Italian-American Civil Rights League rally in Columbus Circle in June 1971. He survived, but spent the remaining 7 years of his life in a vegetative state. Leadership vacuums, revenge killings, and internal power struggles continued until 1975. Over 20 men died. The Colombo family never fully recovered. It remains the weakest of New York's 5 families to this day. Number 6. The Camorra Wars, Naples, 1979 to 1983. Over 400 dead. What happened in Naples between 1979 and 1983 was not a gang war. It was a civil war. The Nuova Camorra Organizzata, led by Raffaele Cutolo, a man who ran his organization from inside a prison cell and dressed in a white suit when he held audience, went to war against a coalition of rival clans called the Nuova Famiglia, backed covertly by the Sicilian Cosa Nostra. Cutolo was charismatic, theatrical, and extraordinarily violent. He had built the NCO from scratch inside prison, recruiting inmates and expanding outward. By 1979, his organization controlled significant portions of Naples and the surrounding Campania region. The Nuova Famiglia decided he needed to be destroyed. What followed was 4 years of open warfare in Neapolitan streets. Not targeted killings, mass violence, drive-by shootings in broad daylight, Bombings in public squares, bodies found in cars, in dumpsters, on church steps. Over 400 people were killed in 4 years in one Italian city. Cutolo eventually lost, not on the streets, but in court. He was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1983. He died in prison in February 2021 at the age of 79, having spent over 40 years behind bars. Naples kept bleeding. The Camorra clans that survived the war simply absorbed his territory and continued. They are still operating today. Number 5, the Ndrangheta expansion wars, Calabria and Milan, 1985 to 1991. Over 700 dead. Most people outside Italy have never heard of the Ndrangheta. That is exactly how the Ndrangheta prefers it. Based in Calabria, the toe of Italy's boot, the Ndrangheta is organized not around a central commission like the Sicilian mafia, but around individual family clans called Ndrine. That structure made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to decapitate. There was no single boss to arrest. In the 1980s, as cocaine flooded Europe from South America, the Ndrangheta moved aggressively to control the import trade. They had the family connections in South America, Calabrian immigrant communities in Colombia and Venezuela that the Sicilians lacked. They became the primary cocaine importers for all of Europe. The wars that followed were about who controlled that pipeline. Between 1985 and 1991, in Calabria alone, over 700 people were killed in Ndrangheta-related violence. The city of Reggio Calabria recorded homicide rates comparable to the worst years of the American crack epidemic. The most visible act came not in Calabria, but in Milan. On August 9, 1991, Libero Grassi, a Palermo businessman who had publicly refused to pay protection money and appeared on national television to say so, was shot dead outside his home. He was 67 years old. He had told everyone exactly what would happen to him. Nobody stopped it. The Ndrangheta won those wars. Today, Italian authorities estimate they control 80% of Europe's cocaine distribution. Their annual revenue exceeds 50 billion euros. They are the wealthiest criminal organization on the planet. Number 4, the Gallo-Genovese conflict and the murder of Albert Anastasia. New York, 1957. One very significant body. Some wars are not counted in body count. They are counted in consequence. Albert Anastasia was the boss of what would become the Gambino family and one of the most feared men in American organized crime. He was the operational chief of Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate, personally responsible for overseeing dozens of contract killings. His nickname was the Lord High Executioner. On October 25, 1957, Anastasia sat down in the barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan for a morning shave. 2 men entered, pushed the barber aside, and shot Anastasia multiple times. He lurched out of the chair, appeared to lunge at his attackers. He was actually lunging at their reflections in the mirror, and died on the barbershop floor. The killing was orchestrated by Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino, who had been planning the removal of Anastasia for years. The motive was power consolidation. Anastasia had been selling Cosa Nostra membership, charging men money to be made members, an unforgivable corruption of the institution. The assassination triggered the Appalachian meeting, where over 60 mob bosses gathered at a farmhouse in upstate New York and were raided by a single New York State trooper who noticed suspicious activity. The subsequent federal investigation transformed American law enforcement's understanding of organized crime, directly leading to the creation of RICO statutes that would eventually dismantle the families from the inside. One barber's chair, 50 years of consequences. Number 3, the Second Mafia War, Sicily, 1981 to 1983. Over 1,000 dead. This is the war that turned Sicily into a slaughterhouse. By 1981, the Corleonesi, a clan from the inland Sicilian town of Corleone, led by Luciano Leggio and his ruthless deputy Salvatore Totò Riina, had decided they were done sharing. Riina was a man who had been a fugitive since 1969 and had been living underground in Palermo for over a decade, hiding in plain sight while orchestrating one of the most systematic campaigns of mass murder in Italian history. He believed the old Commissione, dominated by the Palermo families, was weak and corrupt. He decided to kill all of them. The Corleonesi used a strategy called the Lupara Bianca, the white shotgun. Victims simply disappeared. No body, no crime, no murder charge. Hundreds of men vanished in 1981 and 1982. Some were dissolved in acid. Some were burned. Some were buried in foundations and fields. But many were not hidden. They were left in the street as messages. The most powerful bosses in Sicily were killed one after another. Stefano Bontate, head of the Santa Maria di Gesù family, and considered the most influential boss of his generation, was killed on his birthday, April 23, 1981. Salvatore Inzerillo, another top boss, was killed weeks later. His brother Pietro fled to America. The Corleonesi had him killed there too. By the end of 1983, the Corleonesi controlled the entire Sicilian Commissione. Over 1,000 people were dead. Riina ruled Sicily from underground, without a public face, without a trial, without ever once being photographed. He was finally arrested in Palermo in January 1993. He had been hiding there for 24 years. Number 2, the war against the Italian state, Italy, 1982 to 1993. Hundreds dead, including judges, generals, and children. At a certain point, the Cosa Nostra stopped fighting other criminals and started fighting the country itself. General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa was one of the men who had dismantled the Red Brigades, Italy's most dangerous domestic terrorist organization. He was sent to Palermo as prefect in 1982 to do the same to the mafia. He arrived in April. He was assassinated in September. 4 months. His wife, Emanuela Sedi Carraro, was killed beside him. A bodyguard died with them. Riina ordered it. Judge Giovanni Falcone had spent his career constructing the legal architecture to prosecute the Cosa Nostra. The Maxi trial of 1986 to 1987, which he and his colleague Paolo Borsellino built from the testimony of Pentito Tommaso Buscetta, resulted in 338 convictions. It was the most significant prosecution of organized crime in history. On May 23, 1992, Falcone was driving from Palermo Airport to the city. Half a ton of explosives had been packed into a highway culvert at Capaci. The bomb created a crater 30 meters wide. Falcone, his wife Francesca Morvillo, and 3 bodyguards died. The explosion registered on seismographs. Paolo Borsellino was killed 57 days later. A car bomb on Via D'Amelio in Palermo. Borsellino and 5 bodyguards. Borsellino had known he was next. He had said so publicly. He walked to his mother's apartment anyway. In 1993, Cosa Nostra bombed the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. They bombed the Lateran Basilica and the Church of San Giorgio in Velabro, in Rome. A 10-year-old girl named Claudia Ciccia was killed in a bomb attack in Milan. They were trying to terrorize a government into leaving them alone. Instead, they handed Italy the political will to destroy them. Rina was arrested in January 1993. His successor, Bernardo Provenzano, was arrested in 2006 after 43 years as a fugitive. The Maxi trial convictions were upheld. The Cosa Nostra never recovered its pre-war power. But it cost a judge on an airport highway, a prosecutor outside his mother's door, and a 10-year-old girl who had nothing to do with any of it. Number 1. The Five Families Wars, New York City, 1930 to 1931. The purge that built modern organized crime. Everything on this list, every war, every bomb, every body, traces back to one moment. 2 years in New York City when the rules were written in blood. It began with Salvatore Maranzano and Giuseppe Masseria, the 2 most powerful Italian-American crime bosses of the Prohibition era. Both Sicilian. Both convinced they should rule alone. Their conflict, the Castellamarese War of 1930 to 1931, killed dozens of men across New York as their factions fought for dominance. It ended when a younger generation decided both of them had to go. On April 15, 1931, Joe Masseria sat down to lunch at a Coney Island restaurant with his associate and trusted deputy, Charles Lucky Luciano. They ate. They played cards. Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. 4 men entered and shot Masseria dead at the table. He was found slumped over with an ace of spades in his hand, though some accounts suggest that detail was arranged after the fact. Luciano denies everything. 5 months later, Salvatore Maranzano, who had declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, and was planning to kill Luciano and several others, was murdered in his own Park Avenue office by 4 men posing as IRS agents. He was stabbed and shot multiple times. In the weeks that followed, an estimated 30 to 90 Italian-American mob figures were killed in coordinated hits across the country. It was called the Night of the Sicilian Vespers. Whether those numbers are accurate or legend has been debated by historians ever since. What is not debated is the result. Luciano, with Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, reorganized American organized crime entirely. 5 families, a national commission, rules for killing bosses. It required a commission vote, rules for territories, rules for membership, a corporation with a board of directors, and a dispute resolution process. It was, in its way, a work of institutional genius, built on a foundation of 30 dead men. The structure Luciano built in 1931 governed American organized crime for 50 years. Every war on this list, every Gallo, every Genovese, every Gambino, every Bonanno conflict happened inside the framework those killings created. Every piece was temporary because the violence that built the institution never left its DNA. Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946. He died of a heart attack at Naples Airport in 1962. He was reportedly meeting with an American producer about a film of his life story. He never saw a courtroom that held him permanently. He never saw his creation stop killing. Every war on this list, from Bumpy Johnson's counterpart Bumpy Johnson, started with power and ended with graves. But Italian organized crime added something the American street wars mostly lacked: institutional memory. These organizations had rules. They had structures. They had oaths taken on burning holy cards in candlelit rooms. They built governments inside governments, and they lasted for over a century. And the most devastating part is not the body count. It is the machinery. Because machines do not stop when their builders die. They keep running. The Ndrangheta is richer today than ever. The Camorra still controls Naples. There are men in Calabria and Palermo and New York who took the same oaths in the same ritual that men took in 1931. 100 years of killing, and the machine is still running.